happy Thursday. Good morning. Welcome to ND Talk. I hope we are live and showing everyone. Yeah, I hope you can all hear us. Clearly, Jonathan's away today. I'm in the producer's chair, so we're going to see how this rolls. But we do have a great guest with us today. We got Zach Racknerud here.
Good morning.
It is a good morning, Zach. How are you doing today?
I'm wonderful. Just going to enjoy this little bit of heat while we have it.
Exactly. Take the couple days while we get it here. We'll see how it rolls. I look forward to keep going. We actually have audio. I am shocked. We are live. I see the picture. This is a good day. I did it right like 10 minutes ago. I didn't have a camera working. I was scared this wasn't going to go.
Well, hey, that's awesome. We're ready to rock.
I love it. So, tragically, yeah, we're going to start on a somber note, kind of. I probably, if you haven't noticed or seen the news yet, unfortunately, Minot Police Department recently had another officer pass away. Really tragic news, especially with the last few months, how things have been going there. We just want to offer all of our condolences to everyone at the Minot Police Department, the city, the families involved from Dakota in here. Terrible situation, but really look forward to Minot Police Department bouncing back stronger than ever, especially considering everything that's been going on.
Yep. We got a tight-knit community here, so it's good to see the outpouring of support, but certainly family, friends, everybody's on our minds.
Yeah, undoubtedly so. We're going to start rolling into some legislative talk today. If you're joining us live, make sure you leave a comment. I have them pulled up so I can see them if you decide to talk with us. Make sure you like, subscribe, all the things. And speaking of subscribe, before we jump into some legislative discussion about budget, property tax, all that fun stuff, Zach, you recently started a podcast.
Yes, sure did.
Tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, so Logan Longton, my co-creator, and myself have launched what's called the Prairie Populists. And last time I was on the show, we kind of talked about kind of the debrief of the 2024 election.
Yeah.
And one of the things we really identified is that there is a pretty big gap of a left of center voice here in North Dakota and the greater upper Midwest overall. So we just decided to jump in and try to do something about it. So Logan Longton and myself, we created what's called the Prairie Populists, and it's a left of center program that is, we're really going to be talking a lot about the federal issues because that's where we find that there's a lot of a gap missing is, the incoming Trump administration. And there's a dominant right-wing media in the country right now, especially in alternative media and online and stuff like that. If you look at the top podcasts in the country, it's like 5 out of the 10 are like, the Ben Shapiro Show, the Daily Wire, all that kind of stuff is dominating. So
that new emerging medium of what we're doing here, podcasting, it's becoming the next big thing. And you're trying to do a lot of that, bridging the gap between North Dakota Democrat values and trying to get a lot of the national values more in line and trying to see how that gap is bridged.
Exactly.
Okay.
So North Dakota does have a rich history of left-wing populism. And you know very much about it. I've seen you do write-ups on the Nonpartisan League.
Yep.
And I mean, it's pretty wild to look back on that history because like their name, like obviously people associate that with the Democrats today, but back when they were, a large organization, they really were nonpartisan. They had Republicans and Democrats alike were both running on the nonpartisan ticket, you could call it, even though they used the two major parties to kind of get their agenda accomplished.
Because it was a league of people of a lot of them farmers and workers in the state of North Dakota all banded together. One main big issue was back in 1915, they wanted to build a grain elevator in the state, and it'd be a state-run and operated grain elevator. So instead of trying to co-opt one party, they formed this league that would send candidates into both parties, whichever would if it's a Republican district, they're going to have their partisan candidate run as Republican. If it's a Democrat district, vice versa. And they built themselves up that way, and then in I think the 40s is when they eventually merged with the Democratic Party here in the state.
Yep. So it's a fascinating history, and what we really want to do is we want to point out that left of center policy has really helped North Dakota. You think about the state bank and the state mill and elevator, that's state controlled operation to kind of hold the market accountable. And that's, if you were to propose something like that in the legislature today, imagine how much that would go down in flames. We've really shifted our culture, and we just want to bring attention to the fact that putting partisanship aside, as it exists today, which is hard to do, we do believe that left of center policy has a place at the table, and we want to try to, in the face of a Republican supermajority, we want to try to bring that to people.
Fair. Well, that's great. And you have 2 episodes out already. You've
Yes.
interviewed was Devin Maddens and Dr. Shelley Lenz, who ran for governor in, was it 2020?
Yep.
Perfect.
Yep. And this weekend we'll be interviewing Trygve Hammer, who ran for Congress last time.
Answered my next question.
Yep.
So next week sometime, next video? Or?
Yeah, so our schedule is looking to be Monday and Wednesday drops. So
Perfect.
keep an eye out. We're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Facebook, all that jazz. So
I love
very populous. Check us out.
Definitely do so. It's going to be great. I just love people that are, I guess, to be blunt, that are under the age of 40 trying to expand into the new medium of broadcasting, media, whatever it might be, trying to be the voice for the next generations in the state. And I don't hope that didn't sound too pretentious, but I think it's great to see you, other people, everyone around the state trying to bridge out and take that next step.
Yeah, thanks. Hopefully we can start to see some of that new generation kind of get into government too, because it's not a lot of us in there right now.
Not yet, but give it another decade. I think things will change. Hopefully, at least, right? That's the goal. Running off, though, speaking of that state legislator that doesn't have a ton of us, one thing that we can jump into real fast, Governor Kelly Armstrong just dropped his new budget proposal for the 25 to 27 biennium. It is at $19.89 billion, so a slight decrease from what outgoing Governor Burgum submitted. I haven't dove into it too deep, just have some basic numbers on it. Looking at a little bit, obviously this includes his property tax reform proposal in it. And one thing that he wants to do is have those caps, and this we can get into that in a little bit. We'll start with, do you have any takes on the budget proposal in general? Nothing too deep by any stretch.
Yeah, just in general. So just like you, I've been pretty busy with the podcast and stuff, so I haven't dug deep into it. Mm-hmm. But, watching some of the state of the state, I'm very thankful that we have Governor Armstrong. I think that he is somebody, I ran against him in 2020, but I have a lot of respect for him. I think he's somebody who cares genuinely about the people of this state. For sure. And so I'm very happy that, I think we could do a whole lot worse on the GOP side than Governor Armstrong. So just to hear him, there's stuff I disagree with, but there's also plenty I do agree with. I appreciate that he's really cognizant of the fact that he wants government to be innovative to help the people in North Dakota. Mm-hmm. And some of the proposals I've heard with that, I think, are promising. So I'm looking forward to seeing what kind of legislation that he will champion and get through, because I think there is some good stuff in there. And also, I do think that some of the worst from stuff that I don't like, I think he's going to be a lot like Governor Burgum, where he'll veto kind of that really far right stuff. So thankful for him.
And be interesting to see how he really plays it out. It's just starting. Obviously, they're just now starting to get into a lot of discussion with the property tax bills in committee. So we're going to start in the next week or so here really to see how those take shape, see if any of them start to rise to the surface. One other thing with Governor Armstrong, too, before we get rolling too far, you mentioned with that State of the State address, him and his new Lieutenant Governor Michelle Strinden, obviously they are working. She's taking on some extra steps being a legislator herself. So they both have that experience working in the state legislature. I know that, how do you think that affects it?
Well,
do you think it makes a difference having that much of a backing knowledge coming into it?
Yeah, definitely. Because especially when you're talking about like North Dakota being a citizen legislature, mm-hmm. and I don't think we've seen the term limits themselves kick into full gear yet, but we've seen, some folks are stepping down in anticipation of that. So there is more turnover than there used to be in the past. Mm-hmm. So that experience helps a lot as far as getting people up to speed and really being efficient and getting stuff through. Cause I think you saw there's probably 1,400 bills this time around as they're estimating.
It's just absurd. And I wanted to touch on that with you as well. So when you're going through hundreds of bills in about a 3-month time frame, Jonathan and I have hit on this a lot, and Jonathan, if you're watching, I'm sure you'll be chuckling. But what do you think they have enough time to properly assess and get through everything, especially when it's this much bulk in about a 3-month time period?
I would doubt it from a practical standpoint. I think a lot of it probably does boil down to third-party entities filling in lawmakers and giving them kind of the details of why these bills in committee are good and bad. Mm-hmm. 3 months is pretty short, though, and you're like, if this continues to get more and more bills, like, we might have to look at reform in that way, because it's pretty tight.
At a certain point, if you start, and this obviously would take quite a bit of legislation to happen, but if they were to start doing an annual legislative session to try to start breaking these things down, so instead of having, you know, multiple hundreds, maybe just have 150, 200 every year to try to lessen that massive impact, because you have 100 and some legislators. So, and if everyone wants to try to get a bill or two in session, I mean, it adds up pretty fast. But if you're able to take this and spread it out a little more evenly, do you think that could affect things, especially considering when term limits start coming into play?
Yeah, that's going to be huge when we really have full turnover of the legislature. I think maybe part of it too, and this is just off the cuff, I would have to dig into it more, but
100%.
The idea that every single bill needs to be heard by the General Assembly, maybe there could be reform where, hey, if it fails unanimously in committee, maybe it just dies there. Rather than
not saying give the committees all the power, but maybe just give it a little bit more life, kind of thing.
Something like that, because it's getting to the point, you know, like end of session, a lot of our lawmakers are just exhausted. Like,
exactly,
it's a lot.
I mean, I do this for a few hours a night, a few days a week, and it's exhausting trying to sort through these. So, just quick other side note, I mentioned on Tuesday we might try to look at some Dunseith debacle, any legislation towards that. Yeah, I tried to dive in. I didn't get very far. Couldn't find anything. Hopefully we're going to get an interview set up with Charles in the next week or two. Nothing's concrete yet, but make sure to check out for that. Anyways, back to the legislative session. Before we dive too deep into property taxes, are there any one or two bills you want to talk about?
I guess what I would say
Give you a little platform to soapbox to stand on for it.
Yeah, it probably comes to no surprise to you, but I do want to say that to Representatives Hoverson, Van Winkle, and Castaneda and Forty, I am embarrassed by your representation. I think a lot of the bills that are coming out that are restricting freedoms, a lot of these, far right people, especially here in Minot, will claim to be people who want small government, but they're advocating for the largest, most cumbersome government I've ever seen. And I'm just really, there's a lot of people who are very upset with the fact that instead of trying to improve our lives, they're trying to get government on our backs in a really big way, through the 10 Commandments bill, through the compulsory saying the pledge, all this kind of stuff that doesn't actually change any values at an individual level. It just kind of makes the state pretend that things are okay. And while ignoring the fact that people are struggling out there. So that's what I would say is we look forward to trying to hold you accountable in the next election.
Well, one thing on a similar vein I want to mention too is I believe I saw, I think you didn't directly mention it, but the Blue Laws reenactment is something I believe I saw that in committee that was recommended to do not pass. So odds are that one probably isn't going to be going anywhere. So
I think a lot of these probably aren't going to go anywhere, thankfully. Like I mentioned, I think Governor Armstrong will veto some of this.
Exactly. And that gets back to our former point. We're going through these hundreds and hundreds of bills, and half of them aren't even going to go anywhere, especially when we have this big of an issue with property tax reform. And
just a waste of time.
Exactly. I don't know. Maybe I'm being too picky and nitpicky with it, but it feels like their very limited time once every 2 years could be used a lot more efficiently.
For real.
But here we are. So do you want to dive in? Do you want to touch on anything else before we start diving into property taxes a little bit?
The only thing I would say else would be that I think that there's growing bipartisan sentiment for full school meals in our schools, and I just want to say I hope that passes, because I think that whether Democrat or Republican, I think that we can probably all agree that, number one, it's a relief for our working families in the state to not have to pay those lunch bills at school. I mean, we pay for everything else at school. Why can't our taxes just go to feeding children and not having to worry about a bad parent making a kid feel ashamed at school? And I'm really glad to see that seems to be growing. I know that they're seeking right now, trying to get a GOP member to sponsor a bill, and I hope that happens, because we don't care about getting the credit. We want the policy. So I would love to see that.
That's fair. And I know that's been a growing sentiment around the country too, it's especially at state levels, has been and you take that as how you want, if North Dakota's right for it or not. But it's been something that's been growing and building at state levels across the country. And so it's not shocking that something like this is showing up at North Dakota. Yep. And a lot of people, like I'm assuming you would say, it's probably something long overdue.
Oh, 100%. We saw it during the pandemic. I mean, the federal government stepped in and did it for us. And so that's a lot of the thing I think that happened in this last election on the left side of the aisle, is that we had so much pandemic aid, like stuff like free lunches and stuff, that people, it just went away. And then all of a sudden, prices went up and incomes went down. That's a very bad mix. So
these numbers don't work well
exactly.
when you start getting into the practical matters.
Yeah.
And so starting to dive into the property tax discussion a little bit. Last Thursday, we touched on it, and we got a comment from one of our viewers. And they asked, what do you two want for property tax reform, referring to myself and Jonathan? Who benefits from it? If you want the normal person benefiting, this seems to be a great plan. And that's referring to Governor Armstrong's. It seems that there are ultra-conservatives out there that want to shrink the government by a large amount and don't give a darn about property taxes on the normal folk. They just use them to try to push their plan to zero all budgets and start again at zero with all budgets. Am I wrong? And I'm taking the first part of your question a lot further than the second part. I don't necessarily think you're wrong. I feel like I agree. I think the push to go to zero all budgets and start over isn't the most practical matter. I feel there are better ways to do it. If I can get on a soapbox for a second, I would even, and I have at times argued that you can say taxation is a form, this is terrible to even say on stream, but it's a form of theft in a way. However, we live in a first world society in a place where it's not practical to live by that mantra. I've realized that. So I've formed a property tax proposal, and I would like to break it down a little bit. So enjoy this. Preface, this is not the Dakotans' property tax proposal. This is Kyler's. So I don't take this as too seriously. This is something that I've come up with over the last few days. I don't know a ton about property taxes outside of the last about year and a half of starting to really look at this stuff. But I have a few major points that I want to talk about and push off of and get your opinions on, Zach, because I'm sure, well, I guess before we do you have any takes on Governor Armstrong's property tax proposal?
I've been pleasantly surprised by a lot of the property tax proposals. I think that I think when, Governor Armstrong was governor-elect, he talked about how, don't send me anything that doesn't include significant reform. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of these proposals, both Lausers and Armstrong's, have a lot of that reform that's going to be necessary. Mm-hmm. I like the caps. I think that is something that creates that sustainability, especially that 3% mark. I mean, I shouldn't say most, but a lot of people in their jobs are kind of used to the average cost of living raise is typically about 3%. So mm-hmm. It seems like a pretty
an acceptable cap for market standards.
Yeah. And while providing flexibility when there's bigger projects that may arise to, each of the two bills has different mechanisms for that flexibility, but overall, I think that they're good proposals, and, it's a way better alternative than doing nothing and then having the abolition come back on the ballot in a few years.
For sure. And before we dive in, Marla Stewart on YouTube asked, do you know who sponsored the no cell phones in school bill? Off the top of my head, I don't, but I can definitely look into that. And do you know off the top of your head?
I don't. I haven't heard that one. It's interesting.
Yeah, I saw a headline on this last night. There is a bill out there that is banning phone use in schools during class time. I don't know more than that. That's the headline I read.
I imagine 99% of schools already do, but
I feel like I want to say there's more to it than that, but I haven't read the bill. So I will look into that one for you, Marla, and next Tuesday we'll have an update at the latest. So, excuse me. So to start to dive into my property tax reform, because I wanted real reform. I wanted to show something that has legitimate differences, and I don't know how well it would work in a practical sense. I think it's pretty pragmatic. So I want to first mention my, instead of assessments and the way they're used at fair market value in our current assessment protocol, I want to change it to a rolling average market value assessment. So you take the average, assessors still do their job every year and assess the properties. However, you take it and you average it out over an 8-year period. So the last 8 years of property assessment all comes together in your current property tax assessment. So hopefully, in theory, that can reduce volatility and massive raises. It effectively acts as a cap on itself. That's my first part of it.
Yeah, I like that.
Next one, I want to have a cap for senior citizens. I don't believe, I think their cap, this number is arbitrary. I threw it down. It should cap property taxes on senior citizens at 2.5% of their annual income. No more than that. Again, that number is arbitrary. Find a number you want, by all means. Argue on that all day.
Yeah.
Another one I have is every resident in North Dakota must declare a primary residence, especially if you are a homeowner, landowner, or property owner of any sort. Then that primary residence is taxed differently from any other property or residence that is owned.
Yep. That's my favorite part of Governor Armstrong's proposal is creating a new classification of property, because I think that really kind of helps separate the fact that, when you have your primary residence, like that's something like incredibly important to people. And then, when you branch out to second homes, lake homes, et cetera, that's where you can maybe have more opportunity. That's more of a want to have more than a need to have.
Yeah, 100%. And one thing, my biggest gripe with Armstrong's, especially the more I dive into it, I like, again, I just said toothless. I will stand by that, especially in the short term. Long term, obviously, his plan has some big goals and some lofty aspirations. He wants to get down to a $0 property tax at some point with his plan. Again, I feel like that could be damaging the legacy fund with some of the ways that the spending's done. But also, aside from that, I don't think it's obtainable because of how long the process is supposed to go for. Yeah. And if you put anything out past 4 years, the odds of it getting done in the modern political landscape, I think, are closer to 0 than 100 by all means.
Yeah, especially because isn't a lot of the expansion of the primary residence credit coming from the legacy fund in the first place?
Especially right off the bat.
Yeah, we're depleting it, and then we want to try to stabilize it for future abolition. Like that doesn't seem like a great strategy.
Yeah, and that's one of my biggest gripes with it too. So instead of that, before we get to that, I have also another exemption. So we mentioned the senior citizen one. I have another exemption, and that is for active farmlands. That provides a 2/3, again, arbitrary number, 2/3 tax rate reduction for up to, again, 5,000 acres of actively farmed land. Obviously, you have to prove that somehow. And again, the acreage number is arbitrary. You can give that higher or lower, but my goal was to incentivize smaller family farms. If that's a reasonable number or not, take that as you will. Then how you tax those non-primary residences, it's based on the land and property size, and I want it to be a flat rate percentage, so it's even across the board. Obviously, everyone might not love that part, but again, I think the primary residence should be taxed differently from any other residence at that point, or property. And again, I've added some exceptions in there. This won't go anywhere clearly, but I thought it's a fun exercise to try to dive into it a little bit and give something that I think is a very big break from where we currently stand, because this would eliminate the homestead tax credit, things like that. And it would, I think, make it a more fair and equitable approach. And hopefully it would also, I did try to do some basic math, and this would at least generally lower property taxes for the vast majority of people. It might not be as dramatic of a relief as some people would want, of course. Everyone wants that 0%. In a perfect world, we'd have it, but here we are again. And I think this is a lot more practical.
Yeah, I like a lot of this. It's I think it's always good for citizens in general to be thinking about these things and to be engaged with the processes. And that always opens up. The more that people kind of learn about these things, they can get more involved. Whether it's submitting testimony, maybe running for office themselves. We have a citizen legislature, so the more people that can get involved, I think it's healthy for our state. So I love it.
Exactly. And one thing to touch on with that too, you mentioned this earlier, and the citizen legislature, and I believe I haven't looked too deep into this also either, but I believe they have a bill to try to give themselves a raise. How do you think about that?
I haven't looked at the specifics.
I haven't either. This is headline worthy, so this is just off the cuff reaction.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that they say raise, but isn't it a lot for legislators more of a per diem kind of thing. Like
more so. It raises that per diem, and I think it gives an extra. I didn't look at the numbers, but I think it gives a couple extra bucks a month for. Yeah. I think it evens out numbers, and then they add to their per diem.
Yeah, I think honestly, I don't know if you and I will agree on this, but I've always been more of somebody who appreciates more of the professional legislature. And I was listening to a Bill Burr clip yesterday. The comedian.
Of course,
yeah. One controversial thing he kind of says is that we need to actually raise pay for like even our federal Congress by a lot, because what happens is that when you underpay these folks, like a lot of people think like, oh, they're just these rich elitists, but if you want regular people to get in there, you have to, make sure that they have, enough to live. And I think in an ideal citizen legislature, I'd like to see it where it's more of a salary that, like regular people can actually get involved and not have to coddle up to special interests to get a payday when they leave.
I have 2 points on that. So first, you can, this is a fair point, because clearly most people aren't like Doug Burgum or Donald Trump and can't just waive their salary. Furthermore, you look at the broader spectrum of it, and I was going somewhere with that, but anyways, aside from that, I think it would be a really interesting thing to look into. I think for sure. Oh, because yes. So I do remember where I was going with that now. It came back. Okay. So you mentioned with the professional legislature, do you think that would cut back on, obviously you said special interests, but also things like it's hard to prove these things, but insider trading and things allowing these people, professional legislators at our federal government to increase their net worths by absorbent amounts?
Oh yeah. I think that I think they need to go hand in hand, right? If you're going to increase their pay to give them like more of a comfortable living rather than, it's one of those things like it's a very comfortable salary in a state like North Dakota, but Washington DC is a whole nother ballgame. And I think they would need to go hand in hand where you ban stock trading and say that, hey, if you're a member of Congress, you need to have like a blind trust or a 401k, something that you just contribute to blindly. And then the market overall, the country overall does well, then you do well. Individual stocks is nonsense. And that's what I found interesting about Biden's farewell address. He gave one last,
last night. Yep.
Yeah. He gave one last little slap to Nancy Pelosi and said that, hey, we should not be able to trade stocks in Congress, because he's pretty upset with her. So.
And, she was one of the driving forces that got him to step down last summer.
Yep. And she's been an horrible inside trader. Like,
her and her husband have, it's an absorbent amount of numbers that they've made from trading, and it's such a sticky slope because you can't guarantee they're given direct insider information, but they have knowledge of all these bills and legislation that's going through not just nationally but all over the country. So it gives them a great place to start for these things, and I think that's just one of the many ethics issues that we have at the national federal level. But that's a whole different conversation at that point. Oh, yeah. Fun times, Zach, we live in right now.
It's going to be interesting.
It is. I look forward to it. Do you want to, have you looked at Scott Lauser's tax reform bill?
So surface level last night, once you sent me this stuff, I kind of dug into it and pleasantly surprised again. I see that the Education Association supports this proposal, so that's a good sign. So again, coming at this from a very surface level perspective, I like the idea of, again, it has the caps, the 3%, right? Yeah. And kind of the difference between Lauser's and Armstrong's that I can see from my surface level view is the mechanism with which to increase in special circumstances. Looks like Lauser's bill would require some kind of community referendum, which isn't a bad idea. I think that it's healthy for civic engagement to get folks to, get to the ballot to vote for these kinds of bigger projects if it directly implicates their property tax. So that's good. Whereas Armstrong's is more of like, hey, you can bank it and you can save it for successive years. So I'm trying to remember, there was like one piece of his that I should have wrote down. I'm sorry, but
you're fine.
Yeah, it was just last night I was looking into it. So
yeah, I thought obviously I think it's one of the 5 or 6 I've looked at. I think it's one of the better proposals I've seen for. Obviously, I like mine the best.
Oh, I do remember now. The taking over the mills for the state. That's I'm sure he, obviously he's worked on this for a long time, so I'm sure he has reasons and, justifications for these. But just my surface level impression is that it kind of seems like we've done a lot of that in the past, like taking over social service mills and stuff. And it feels to me like, a lot of the time that can just incentivize, the communities, the local jurisdictions, to kind of take that and run with other areas of their budget. But that's where the cap kind of comes into play, right? Is restricting to 3%. So maybe with a cap, that kind of strategy can work. I just know that it kind of gives me the impression that it's a lot of the same as far as buying up mills.
Fair. And speaking of that 3% cap, Marla on YouTube again asked, how does the property valuations part work with the 3%? So with the valuations can go up and down however they want, but the way I understand it is that your total property tax bill cannot raise more than 3% any 1 year. That's how I see it.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. So I hope that's a good enough answer for you. And then we have another one from Miranda Schuler. This one goes back to what we were talking about. I don't think additional, I can barely read. I don't think additional compensation on the federal level will change the behavior of people who have questionable ethics to begin with.
That's true.
That is a fair point. And yeah, if you already are getting into that and you have issues, obviously that would probably just compound it, but hopefully I think your goal was to say that could incentivize other better people to run for office.
Correct. Yep. And it would be nice. I think the campaign season is a lot of it too, where regular folks, we saw it with Trygve Hammer this last time around, where he raised a good amount of money, and then he's a regular working guy. He's a school teacher, oil well guy. Yeah. He's worked on the railroad. He's not exactly like Mr. Banks or anything. So he had to step away from his job to campaign, but then he used some of his campaign money to give himself a modest salary. Yeah. And that kind of thing spurred some media articles saying that he's paying himself, and it's such a weird thing, because it's yes, but he's a regular working guy who's trying to run for Congress. So we kind of need to shift the culture in that way to say that, hey, if he's making enough to pay his electrical bill during the campaign, there's nothing wrong with that.
So just pure surface of it all, do you want a regular person that can run for office that can take over the level, or do you want it to only be people that can afford to have enough in the bank to roll this out and take off a whole effectively year to campaign?
Yep. And so that's why I said that they would need to go hand in hand. You ban stock trading and raise their pay, so that there's,
Or how about this? You only raise pay to new members of Congress. So anyone that is already established in seat or seated already.
No double dipping.
Yes.
Like it.
That's my very surface level.
That's the theme of today, surface level. Exactly. I was in grad school course till 9:40 last night. So I got your message yesterday. So a lot of this has been pretty off the cuff.
This was all last minute. Don't worry. You're good. That's the fun of this stuff. Yeah. I took 5 hours last night and just dove into it. And other than that, that's where we're at. And but I think that's so much of that leads to a different topic here. That's so much of what most people are able to do. It's hard for someone to really dive into all this stuff because there is such a massive amount of it. And especially if you're just a regular person at home, this isn't my job. I do this as a hobby, but it's hard for anyone that works a full-time job to try to not just keep up, but actually look into a lot of this stuff. And we don't have a ton of coverage of it. So I think, again, I think we always have encouraged everyone to look at it themselves, and we can always provide those resources. But I think it's good that we at least have some form of discussion being presented on it. It just opens it up at this point, in my opinion.
Yep. It's the beauty of the new media is you can just have everybody. It's kind of like just a little discussion, like the old days, just getting together and having a nice little conversation. And no matter how surface level it is, it's still, good stuff to chat and get perspectives.
No, 100%. And that's why we love having you on, to get the other side of this political spectrum from a lot of the people. Well, I guess not recently. We haven't had a ton over the winter. It's cold. People don't want to get out all the time.
Yeah, it's
completely understandable. But one other thing we can kind of talk about here. Have you looked into any of the criminal justice reform proposals that Governor Armstrong's presented, especially with his speaking out against minimum sentencing?
I have seen, so I listened to the Plain Talk appearance that he was on, and it's really interesting to see kind of this, it's almost a bubbling sort of fight between the Attorney General and the governor. And, I'm glad that's another reason I'm thankful for Governor Armstrong. I think he understands kind of the core roots of a lot of these issues when it comes, because he was, defense guy for years and years.
Exactly. So, he was a defense attorney. Yeah. That was his career. I mean, obviously he worked in the oil field too, but that was what he went to college for.
Yep. And I think he understands that, it just seems we've tried the minimum sentencings in the past, the 1990s crime bill was a lot of that, the three strikes rule and all that. And in the short term, we saw, a decline from the height of violence in the 1990s, but long term, it's not solving the systemic issues that cause the crime.
It's
in
a
the first
Band-Aid.
place. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that Governor Armstrong alludes to that, and he has seen, especially working at the federal level, the differences that it can really enact going for something that has those mandatory minimums. I feel like it's an outdated policy at this point, and it's time for something new. Maybe that something new won't work, but I think it's time to turn that page and work on fixing some of the more core issues at the heart of the problem rather than just locking them up. Because like Governor Armstrong says, our jails are already overfilled.
Yep. And I ain't going to help.
No, exactly. You just start throwing more people in there, it's not going to help by any means.
Yeah, and I like his trust in the judicial system. He says that, he trusts judges to understand, like, they put in a lot of work for their careers and to understand, like, each case is an individual. Like, there's no reason to put one category crime all the exact same when there's different circumstances. There's different aspects of the case that might warrant longer sentences or might warrant shorter.
Yeah, it's not a black and white issue. Yeah. There's in legal matters, especially broadly across the spectrum, it is such a gray area. I think it's hard, and context matters. Yep. I think it's hard to really try to nail down just a minimum 1 year kind of thing for that. And
even something as simple as remorse, like that can go into effect, like for a judge in their sentence. If somebody, you can tell they're genuine and they genuinely want to improve, they've demonstrated their willingness to improve, is a lot different than somebody who's, putting up the middle finger in the courtroom. Like they shouldn't be given the same sentence.
Yeah. And that's 100% there. And I really think that moving forward, hopefully they can try to find some ways to not just tackle the overcrowding issues, but really work on reform too, and try to get some better ways to make sure the people that are already in jail do not, they're not repeat offenders at that point. Recidivism, something like that, I think is the term. Yeah, to try to limit that as much as possible. And I really hope that they can try to swing something of that nature. Obviously, this isn't probably going to be the session for it, for anything too in depth, but hopefully that's something that can really come up in the future.
Yeah, and we have a proud history of that here in North Dakota. Our state penitentiary is actually like of a national focus. Like there's been pieces on it that's more akin to the Nordic model than it is anything, where the state penitentiary is not like the gray bars and cement walls. It's like a place where people can have genuine chances at redemption and genuine chances at rehabilitation. That should be the goal of our criminal justice system, 100%. And I think Governor Armstrong understands that, so I'm again very thankful for him.
Exactly. And Miranda Schuler commented, it can be really confusing to understand much of it too. Discussion is a form of education. Great point. And I think that's what a lot of what we're trying to do here is just present an open conversation for a lot of things and just get people talking. And hopefully for you watching, this gets you talking at home too. Make sure you can share this all over. Get your family talking about it. And I before we start wrapping up, I want to touch on one other thing with that too. Attorney General Wrigley has been, obviously he's been an attorney for a long time, so he knows the depths of this stuff. But just want to point out he originally goes back to George W. Bush as a state district attorney. And so that just shows...
it's prosecutor versus defense attorney.
I know, it's where a lot of his original leanings probably stand. I can't say that for certain, but I would assume coming up in that era probably has a lot of those old hardline views on things. And so I think it's starting to show where you have someone who, I'm not going to call Kelly Armstrong a moderate, but comparatively on this issue is much more moderate. And I think you really get to see the dichotomy of it, of some more new age thinking versus that 1990s, early 2000s hardline, we're not touching this kind of thing.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. And, should I make someone mad before we go?
Let's do it.
All right. So we didn't touch on this on Tuesday, and I meant to, but we ran out of time. We got talking. We were talking about some resolutions that we're going through the State House, and one major one that we didn't get to talk on was, let me pull it up here, H.R. 5001, and it's a resolution that urges the United States Supreme Court to restore the definition of marriage to a union between one man and one woman. I know you'll have some takes on this, but real fast, I just want to give mine. I believe this is a government overreach that is unnecessary. I don't believe the government should have a say in defining what marriage is between anyone. Obviously, government has a stance in marriage, and we can't get rid of that, but I don't believe it should be their place to define it. I think this is going back to George W. Bush Patriot Act era policies, and I think that the Supreme Court should keep it as it is. And obviously, there are some social justice aspects that maybe can be tempered down a hair, but anything like this, I think, is far too much of an overreach from the government.
Yep. This issue deals with adults, and adults should have the freedom in the United States to consenting adults to be partners in life. Marriage has obviously roots in religion, but marriage is also a social contract. It has tax implications. It has, agency at end of life. There's all kinds of things that you can hear tragedies of folks in the past who have been partners and have not been able to enjoy those rights. Mm-hmm. And since 2015, they have enjoyed those rights. So we're going the wrong way. I do believe that the Supreme Court will overturn Obergefell, and that's tragic. And rather than this that encourages them to do it, we should be codifying our own standards so that when it goes, that people that, have a same-sex partner are able to enjoy the same protections, because it's a fundamental liberty issue. And I don't understand that you want small government, but you want this gigantic mountain-sized government telling them that they can't live their life how they want to live it.
Yeah, this echoes some of the comments I had on Tuesday when talking about the Ten Commandments thing. I have no issue with the Ten Commandments being in a classroom. I think it's probably morally great for a teacher to hang that up. My biggest issue is the government trying to step in and say these need to be in every classroom in every school. That's my biggest issue. I don't think that... I want the government out of your wallet and out of your pocketbook, and I believe that they should not just be out of your financial issues, but out of your personal issues as well. And we can take that as you will, but I'm sure some people will disagree with that and want to see that repealed, and I understand the basis of that. But if you are a conservative, I believe you should see this as governmental overreach, and hopefully you do. And if not, I understand this is probably more of a religion matter, and I can't argue that. That's fair argument on your end, but I'm going with the practical governmental matter on it. So take that one as you will.
Fair enough.
Well, Zach, do you have any lasting takes before we go?
Lasting takes. I got to do one.
Please do.
Our last discussion, I do have to ask, after the confirmation hearing yesterday, are you still enthused about Pete Hegseth, or have you kind of changed your tune?
Okay, fair. Yeah, I'm not surprised this came up. So, the more I've gotten to figure out who Pete Hegseth is, I'm not a fan of him as a person. I still like the general idea of getting someone completely out of the box and taking that role. But yeah, I don't necessarily love Pete Hegseth. I'm not the biggest advocate of drinking, and I know he is a advocate of drinking. So
yeah, fair.
That shouldn't disqualify someone necessarily, but on a personal matter, yeah, I'm not a fan.
Yeah, I guess the biggest thing I had was Mark Esper had the whole situation where he defied the president and wouldn't shoot protesters in the leg, and Pete Hegseth would not commit to standing up for the Constitution, and that's disqualifying to me. I understand your point of view that, somebody who's not in the Pentagon bureaucracy could be good, but
you don't want someone that just is a yes man on the flip
rubber
side.
Stamps the legal actions, because there's a lot of troubling things that are potentially coming. So
I can see the argument on that end. So you have someone that is completely out of the loop, and they're being put into this position from someone that they admire and look up to. And now when that person that you admire and look up to tells you to do something questionable, it's hard to say no.
Yeah. So if the executive branch wants to deploy the U.S. military inside the grounds of the United States, that's going to set a precedent that is very scary. Yeah. And I hope we don't get there, but it's looking more and more likely.
Everything's going up from here, right?
We'll see.
Well, I guess one other take I have on those, since we're on the topic, hopefully you're all enjoying this. We're just kind of going now. Isn't it a mess how just partisan those hearings are? You have one side that is just completely cozying up to the guy and the other side that is just completely railing on him.
Yeah.
It just feels like there's no middle ground on it anymore. No one that can try to bring not saying absolutely no one, but it feels like there's not a center, concurrent argument that can be presented on it. It feels like it's one or the other.
Yeah, it'd be nice if, honestly, these are very high positions. It'd be, I think a lot of the time when you're interviewing such a high profile presidential cabinet job, it should be a lot of challenging questions. Mm-hmm. So it goes both ways, right? I'm sure when Biden had his picks coming through, I'm sure the Democrats were like, "What's your favorite ice cream?"
It completely was. Yeah. No, 4 years ago it was the exact same thing,
Yeah.
and 8 years ago too. And it's
Yeah.
it just shows again the partisanship that we have at the national level. And
Yeah.
hopefully we can in the next coming years we can do something about that and bridge some divides and get some gaps covered. But at least this year it doesn't look like anything's changing.
Yeah. Like you said, new generation's coming though. Who knows what'll happen?
Exactly, right around the corner.
Yep.
Well, with that, I think anything else? You good to go?
Good to go. Thanks
I'm
for
ready.
having me on.
Of course, Zach. Everyone, make sure you check out Zach's new podcast, The Prairie Populist, Facebook, YouTube. Make sure you like, subscribe, share, hit the bell for notifications for us to join the Dakotan community. And we just want to say a big shout out to everyone. Thanks for watching.